Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Michael Carter. I'm a member of the DSA and I'll be your moderator for the evening. I want to thank everyone who made this happen. This event is sponsored by Democratic Left, the magazine of Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA Fund, which is devoted to socialist education, and the Ecosocialism and Green New Deal working groups. Thanks to War Books for publishing this fascinating work and providing attendees with a code for 20% off that you'll be able to find in the chat. In our first hour, we'll hear Anders Dunker and Kim Stanley Robinson discuss themes from Dunker's first book, Rediscovering Earth, 10 Dialogues on the Future of Nature. It's there. Attendees should feel free to submit questions for Dunker or Robinson in the Q&A section rather than the chat. And then after that first hour, we'll hear from Ashik Sadiq and Jamila Elder, members of DSA's Ecosocialism and Green New Deal working groups, about DSA initiatives and how you can get involved. Now I'll just introduce the members of our first conversation. Anders Dunker is a writer, journalist, philosopher, and painter. He has taught philosophy, literature, and cultural history at universities in Oslo, Bali, Rome, and Barcelona. He's a contributor to Le Monde Diplomatique and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and is chief critic at Modern Times Review. His first book, Rediscovering Earth, is a series of dialogues with 10 people that each focus on the impact humans have on the environment, what that means for the future, and why we seem to be failing to act on the danger we know is coming for us. One of those conversations is with Kim Stanley Robinson, an American novelist widely regarded as one of the greatest living writers of science fiction. His work often features enormous ecological emergencies and explores how a more equitable, and dare I say, socialist society would respond more effectively than our current growth and accumulation-based capitalist society. Thank you both for spending some time with us. In your recent book, The Ministry for the Future, Stan, you depict diverse perspectives ranging from radical terrorist groups blowing things up to conservative bankers working on fiscal policy. You stress the need for everyone to get involved, and this principle is reflected well in Anders' book because it features people from different disciplines attempting to turn the messiness of our often opposing perspectives into the action we so desperately need. My question for you is how you see those of us who don't run the Federal Reserve and aren't terrorists, and we're somewhere in the middle there. How do we get involved? How do we all join together? What do we do? I think we all feel the danger and we don't know how to take action.
Well, thanks for that, Mike. And I want to begin by saying thanks to the DSA for the existence of the DSA. It's really a pleasure to be a member and to see the work of the organization. And I think of the DSA as one way of trying to do something active in one's own life as a citizen and living creature on this planet to cope with the kind of emergency century that we've entered, a moment of biosphere danger that could slip into a mass extinction event if climate change goes too far. So that the danger, as people say, is existential, but one of the principal ways, maybe even the main way we're going to be dealing with this is by the construction of a new political economy. So it is indeed true that the problem being global needs global solutions. And then people talk about top-down, but let's just say international or global. The agreements of the nation-state system. It's also going to be bottom-up, every living person doing their part. And then I've been thinking that there's something between those two that you might call side-to-side because of the spatial metaphor of top-down and bottom-up. Side-to-side meaning that all of the organizations that are mesocosms between the individual and the global civilization that we're part of are meaningful in this struggle, and it is a struggle. and that comes down to doing things as individuals, joining up into groups like the DSA, but also like your town, one's town's volunteer boards for experts, school boards running for office at the town and county levels. In other words, there's a middle range, side to side political activity that is not neither well described by top down or by bottom up, side to side. And so, thinking about the DSA, um, I'm Anders is Norwegian, although living in Los Angeles, and he can talk about this. But in the European systems, DSA could be a party. In the parliamentary system, you could get representation in, say, your national parliament with rather small numbers, and make an impact that way by becoming a part of a coalition government or in a minority fighting a coalition government that's in power. Well, in the United States, we've got this two-party system that we're stuck with. So, and the DSA has about 75,000 members. It's good, but something like 150 million people voted in the election. So it's relatively small. And we are in a two-party system where if you make a third party that splits, then you tend to harm the party that you're closest to, weakening it and strengthening the party that you oppose. So there's a tactical problem as Americans in the DSA wondering how to cope with the two-party system. And what I'm seeing happening, and what I would like to suggest to answer your question, is that any given member of the DSA is part of a 75,000 person think tank and advocacy group. So, and this is powerful because it's a gift economy where people are volunteering their time and collating their ideas, hashing them out internally within the organization, and then going out there and providing the Democratic Party with tools, with ideas, such that I've heard this said, and I quite agree with it, that in many ways, Bernie Sanders' campaigns won because they changed the Democratic Party. And although he himself was not nominated or elected, the policies that he advocated so strongly and so articulately have, to a certain extent, been taken on board by the larger party that we are a wing of. And indeed, because these are somewhat empty signifiers, Democratic Party, I mean, what does it stand for? Well, you can use big nouns that are so big that they get fuzzy and they don't mean anything. Or you can begin to talk about specific policy suggestions. And when the best suggestions coalesce into something like, say, the Green New Deal, then when we get into an emergency, like the pandemic, like climate change, and the party as a large amorphous group of Americans say roughly half, so what should we do? It's very often the case that the think tank that the DSA forms collectively will be the one providing the best ideas going forward. So just to give a practical example, and then turn it over to Anders, we've got the very strong possibility that $1.9 trillion will be injected into the system as a sort of quantitative easing, assuming that gets passed. Well, what do we do with that? And at that point, green ideas and socialist ideas can be translated, and really translation is a very important process in all this, into American language so that it isn't European or dangerously communistic language, and yet the policies would be the same. And that gets taken up, and suddenly there's more good jobs, there's more security, there's more work being done on infrastructure and on the biosphere in ways that are reflected in some of the other movements that we're going to talk about later today. So in short, there's lots to do and lots of ways to come at this problem.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, for either of you, we don't have a parliamentary system, and so we can't kind of use the formation of coalition governments as this kind of wedge into power. I wonder about this kind of contentious issue that's come up, which is just the idea of primarying Democratic candidates who aren't, or, you know, Democratic politicians who aren't doing the things that we think that they need to do. You know, I think there's a lot of debate about the wisdom of doing that, and I'm kind of curious what you think about that.
Anders, do you want to, shall I go on or do you want to intervene?
I think you
first?
should go on being the American.
Sure.
Yeah. But I'll follow up after.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I'd also like to hear, Anders, your perspective on, you know, how this works from the other side, right? And because I know there's contentions about that, right? About the use of this parliamentary politics to sort of kind of threaten a coalition falling apart.
From the American perspective, I would say I like the idea of competing in primaries because I like the idea that the American left is a group mind where you don't want to shatter by infighting on the left, but come together. So there's a point at which an internal battle over which set of positions and which people represent us, because what you could venture to say is that the American left as a group mind has been making some decisions that are beginning to look pretty good for gaining political power and acting on it. And so sometimes the challenge from the left in a primary will lose, but whoever won, being more center left, will then have to try to hold together that coalition and keep people coming out to vote. So it's a good space, primaries, to pull the party leftward by way of osmotic pressure of simple votes, of a straw poll. It's not quite a straw poll, it's a real primary, but it works as a straw poll for which ideas are getting the most support from the larger American left, which, as we know, starts very moderate center, but needs to hold together to beat the right. So I like primary challenges from the left, and I also like them from the right, because on the right, if the far right were to win a primary challenge, then that would weaken them and be more likely that the right would lose. Both ways, it seems to me that the left wins in this one.
And Anders, what is your experience with this from this European perspective of this kind of, you know, this liberal and left relationship, and the at times sort of aggressive way that the left can try to force people more in the center to take left-leaning policies?
Well, I think, first of all, the scene is very different in Europe, obviously, with a score of different parties in each country. And we have our green parties that are influential, and also influential in Norway, but they're not strong enough to form a government at all. But I think in a broader perspective, the left is in a sort of ongoing crisis and been for a long time. And I feel that green environmental issues are kind of a way to draw people in, and that there's globally, it's very plausible that the left will get a lot of movement from the center and out, and that proposals that used to come from the left will seem like something that everyone will be drawn to and see as reasonable and see as productive, and that it's you would be able to put forth, so to speak, competitive, good policies that really has a direct appeal to each voter, that they would benefit also in the short run. And I guess that's what is attempted with the Green New Deal. And I've read the proposals from the DSA on the Green New Deal. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, and it's you know, let's get into some of those particular policies. You know, with the Green New Deal, is a thing that, you know, Stan, you mentioned in your most recent book, which I read. I guess, you know, I wonder, like you refer to the to the Green New Deal, and is this a thing, you know, do you see, how realistic is it that you think that this will actually get passed in the United States anytime soon? Like, what do you think the outlook on that is, and how can we push that forward when it, you know, there's so much pushback against it, and it's associated with a word that has become really kind of, you know, a bad word in the United States, right? Which is socialism, which means communism, which means all kinds of terrible, scary things, right? And how do we fight back against this demonization of the thing that we all recognize as being a sort of collective good?
Well, that is a problem. I'll answer that part first and then go backwards in your question. Socialism equals communism equals Satanism, and also un-Americanism. So leftists in America have always had to deal with, what do we call ourselves? And I typically, as a science fiction writer, will just say I am an American leftist, and leave it at that, because I have characters that range from center left all the way out to the furthest ends of anarchy, and everything in between, and my books are widely interpreted as such. So I think it's best to say an American leftist, I mentioned this problem of translation. If you say there ought to be state-owned enterprises, and then by that you mean simply the socialist idea that the means of production, and also what you might call the necessities of life, food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, education, and electricity, are all common goods that should not be for profit and denied to people, but are human rights, and therefore should be run as non-profits, you might say, to use an American term. You might say that instead of state-owned enterprises, as one would say in China, you would say they should be public utility districts. Because in America, we understand public utility districts are in the public good, and they don't cause that instant knee-jerk defensive reaction from fellow Americans whom you would hope to persuade by the content and the sheer humanity and sensibility of your answer to the problems that are being faced. By using translation into common American terminology, I do not think this is wishy-washy, but merely a matter of rhetoric and diplomacy to try to get your points across and be persuasive. And you can get, when you get into the details, you can maybe point out later, well, these were the same things. You could maybe say that Texas not believing in public utility districts and privatizing even electricity, therefore build crap systems that fell apart in this recent freeze, and begin to reduce it down to particular arguments where what is ultimately the socialist solution is the best one for ordinary Americans who are not politically sophisticated, have not been educated to any kind of political sophistication that includes the rest of the world's political terminology, to put it in plain terms. Now, that gets you far enough for the Green New Deal. I'm going backwards. Green New Deal.
Sure.
You read HR 103 or 109, I forget the number. It's in American terminology, and it doesn't talk about how to fund it. It doesn't talk about Keynesianism. It doesn't talk about modern monetary theory. It talks about what needs to be supported in ways that are completely American, and it's very good. I mean, you should read the whole thing. I presume everybody has. It's very good on climate justice and on avoiding the really bad racial discrimination that was in the first New Deal of the 1930s. In fact, reversing that and making sure that climate justice is part of this action of the Green New Deal. And the last thing I want to say there is, well, if say they have $1.9 trillion to spend without saying we're going to pass the Green New Deal as a program in and of itself, because there will be resistance to that because of its origins and because of the idea of any one program taking over. But the individual pieces of it, nevertheless, are likely to get funded. And at that point, it's a done deal. And I want to remind people before I turn it over is that the New Deal that we're basing all this in the 1930s actually took about 13 years, and it was 5 discrete moments, and nobody could have predicted or called out for legislation all of the moments that took place over those 13 years. They were an improvisation. So we're at the beginning of an improvisation also. So without getting ticky-tacky about details, I feel like we should say Green New Deal, yeah. And then if you're countering resistance because that already sounds like a commie thing, then you can say, if hopefully you are in conversation with people who are somehow open to talking about this, which is rare enough, you can say, well, it would be good if the government would do would pay for jobs for rebuilding infrastructure. That'd be good jobs. That'd be um, um, excellent work, meaningful work, rebuilding things, making the country more resilient. And the fact that that is was part of the Green New Deal is not really relevant if it gets passed. So I think chances, I actually think we have 2 years and a rather sophisticated administration and control of Congress, experienced centrists who are realizing that they're only going to do well in the 2022 elections, which are traditionally going to go against them, only going to do well by creating results fast. And so they're going to be looking to the Green New Deal, and then they'll pass those actions without maybe putting the label on it. That will be okay. That will be success.
Sure. And Anders, we've been talking a lot about the well, frankly, the mess that is American politics. But in your book, you speak to people from all over the place, right? I'm curious about the perspectives of, for instance, you talk to Vandana Shiva and Dipesh Chakrabarti. So you have these perspectives outside of that. Do they see, I'm curious in your conversations, how they view what is happening in this country, and if they think that passing things like the Green New Deal, like, is that something that looms large in their mind, or is it just they're going to just move on and hope that we get it together?
Yeah, it's funny the way the Green New Deal was kind of borrowed from Roosevelt and America over to Europe, and it actually started the development of the Green New Deal started in the EU and in the UK. So there's kind of a surprising shift there, and I completely agree with Stan that this is kind of a bag where you can throw in a lot of things, and people do a lot of thinking, and there are think tanks involved, and all kinds of political meetings, and it won't be all that consistent, and it won't be the US alone. That said, in my book, for instance, I talked to, as you mentioned, two Indian thinkers, Dipesh Chakrabarti, who is based in Chicago, and Vandana Shiva. And of course, they partly have a post-colonial perspective, and they come from a country that is still modernizing in a way that, to some extent, we have behind us. And with the modernization and industrialization of India, there goes a mentality of sort of building the nation and getting ahead and being in sort of the club of the rich nations and so forth. And that's what we've all been through. And it's reasonable for any government to try to make their countries prosperous and so forth. But at the same time, what happens, and what Chakrabarti talks about, is that what crushes into this whole plan of modernization is the planetary perspective, which is not political. It's not the same as the global or global thinking. It is natural science, it's Earth systems theory, it's the limits of the planet itself, and how much carbon we can let out, and all these things, and it's merciless in a way. So it's a very harsh truth to take in politically, and of course, ideally, you would want to do those two things at the same time, which is what climate justice is all about. You want to you want to make the changes that are necessary, and you want to prioritize the poor and those who are the victims of it. So this is very much Vandana Shiva's perspective, and also to a large extent Chakrabarti. But when it comes to the relationship to the US, well, the book starts with Bruno Latour, and the day I interviewed him, he had just come out with a book that is basically about Trump, and it came out in 2017. And he talks about how denialism is an integrated part of, or was at that time, of US policy, and how that changes the whole game, and how it kind of brings out to the forefront what is at stake. And it speaks a clear language as to how you're thinking if you're not taking in the crisis, and what the political cost is of taking in the responsibilities that we have. So I think in a sense we're past that now. So we're more aware, of course, where we were with Obama, and leaving behind this sort of caricature denialism of the Trump administration. We're in a different place where maybe the risk that is facing us is fake policies and fake solutions, and all the double talk that Greta Thunberg calls people out on when she's in meetings and so forth. There's a lot of talk, and of course, it's not like nothing is being done, but far from enough is being done. And it's very, very hard for people to sort of assess if they are being deceived. And a lot of the, for instance, carbon trading, it's so complex. I talked to someone who was an expert, and she said there's 10 people in the world who really knows this system, how it works, and it doesn't work. And people don't know all these things. And the same thing with direct carbon capture from the atmosphere. There's one such facility in Switzerland, and in 1 year it takes out as much as Munich lets out in a day, something like that. Like, it's negligible, nothing. And it's very hard for people to say. And my book is not written from one point of view, one expert point of view, or even one discipline. So it covers a lot of different disciplines, but it's me asking from a sort of philosophical point of view, from a position of not knowing, just in a Socratic manner. You start out and just try to stop assuming that you know the answers. And of course, some of these thinkers have some straight answers, but it's a lot about sort of trying to understand how long it takes to get all these pieces together and to understand the predicament we're in.
Yeah, and I really wonder with this how much you think the challenge is the slow moving nature of all of these crises, right? If all of this happened super fast, that's the type of thing, you run a plane into a building and everyone takes notice, right? But the sea level rises slowly, causing huge amounts of damage, and we're not particularly good at that, right? And and this is actually, from reading your books, Stan, they often feature these sort of epic moments of huge levels of destruction that people sort of can't turn away from. I guess I wonder how, if we don't have these huge epic moments of destruction, we can instill this feeling in people that the destruction is still there and real and is coming for us all.
Well, it's a good question. And by the way, I've upped my volume. I hope people can hear me better. Let me know in the chat if that's working. There's a propensity in human cognition to feel that if it didn't happen to you, it will never happen to you. So I'm not sure if any one catastrophe will ever push all of humanity into the awareness of the general crisis that is biospheric, the falling into a mass extinction event. It could be that by the time everybody has experienced a bad catastrophe, we'd be past the tipping point into irreparable changes. So I think the challenge is to try to convince people of that. And this is what the scientific community has been doing with the invention of the term the Anthropocene, et cetera, of making the general public aware of the universal danger that is quite profound before we tip over into it and can't get out of it, and can still do human things that are within our ranges of powers to dodge the damage. One of the principle of which is a different political economy, post-capitalist, better than capitalism, which is one name for the creation of the problem itself. And therefore, I feel that DSA members and people on the left have um, instinctively or as a result of study and analysis gone to the right solution, the pressure point, where we could convince people in advance. And there have been disasters enough. I mean, from California, it was burning down last summer. Australia burned for a year. There were massive floods happening everywhere. The glaciers are going away such that the water for 1 billion people in Asia is beginning to go away, etc. And what I'm seeing is that what Marx would have called the general intellect is now aware that we're in this existential global danger as a single civilization. I say that because in 2004, when I published 40 Signs of Rain, that awareness did not exist. That was regarded as an oddball science fiction story of something that could happen but wasn't really happening. And now with Ministry for the Future, 15 years later or whatnot, we are in a different world of awareness. And time is late. I mean, we're told that we have about 10 years to massively cut our carbon burn into the atmosphere. And that's only one of a whole complex mix of problems, as we all know. But I'm saying that this is now generally everybody who owns a phone, which is almost everybody on the planet, has an awareness of this, and that it has to be acted on collectively by the world community. So that first step has been taken. And I think more catastrophes will just hammer home a point that has already been kind of won. Climate denialism now is stupid, and it's shifted instantly to doomism. So people won't say the climate isn't changing because that's become too obvious. They will say, well, there's nothing we can do about it, so let's just party on. So we are in a different moment of the discursive battle, and one where a lot of people are going to say, well, we can't just ignore it and party on. We can't say doom. We've got our children. We got the generations to come. We actually have to struggle harder than ever now. And so I've been suggesting a stepwise system that first you try to, like in your daily life, you try to do what you can do that day. And that involves Democratic Party politics. All of us on the left know that the Democratic Party can get bought by capital, and often has been. And it gets into power and it doesn't do anything very, very impressive. But now in this somewhat more emergency-like understanding, it could be that old solutions from the left will now be seen as simply common sense, the only way out, full employment, working on biosphere, general health care, justice, climate justice, and general social justice. This is beginning to look like, for more and more bigger percentage of the populace, the obvious thing to do. So I think we're at a different inflection moment that could be subtly revolutionary.
Yeah, and speaking of these things that may hopefully become common sense, and I think are common sense in other places, are things like something we're going to hear about later tonight, and I've been thinking a lot about because of what's happening in Texas, which is things like nationalizing the grid. Like, do you, and I guess, Anders, I'll just ask you, like, do you think that, for instance, nationalizing our power grid is a prerequisite for these types of changes? Is it possible to work with privatized systems who are governing things that I think we all on this call agree are effectively public goods, right? And there are these we're now all in we all live in this country where what we consider to be public goods are privately owned. Is it possible to work within that privately owned system to bring about these changes? Or do we have to start by nationalizing all of these things and then we have direct access to our government to force these changes?
Yeah. You want to take that, Stan, or should I say something?
Well, I can say from the American perspective, regulation, which is really a matter of legislation, taxation, strict regulation, sharply progressive taxation, these are passable bills. And what I would say is if we could manage those things, you could create a kind of an American situation where the public has commanded private industry to do what the public wants. So I don't think you need nationalization first. You do need public control of these things, and effectively you can bankrupt them between and you know, antitrust laws, taxation, non-subsidies, the removal of subsidies, and the intense regulation could combine to in effect nationalize them because they are so over controlled. Some will give up the ghost and go bankrupt. Some of them will become nonprofits. You could imagine various ways forward out of this from the current situation. But I'm always resistant to the idea of one big solution. Like when, say, a moment of crisis comes and one of these big things were to go bankrupt, like in 2008, that's the moment to nationalize. When in other situations, I think it's more tactical, and maybe we shouldn't get into tactics, but I think at the tactical level, you use all the tools that are ordinarily used by government to whip private industry into shape and do what the public wants with it.
Yeah. I think that the whole problem of power grids, you can of course see it from the point of view of commons and compare it to drinking water or whatever necessities there are, but they're also of course developed through industry. And Bernard Stiegler, who is one of the participants in the book, he is a philosopher of technology. And when we talk about climate change or environmental problems, we should always bear in mind that it's not like we're a bunch of rabbits stranded on an island and we run out of grass to eat. It's problems that are caused by our industrial systems most often, and the scale of it is because of our industrial systems. And this big pivot that we're trying to do globally is to try to build a global civilization that is not inherently self-destructive, something that can last. And something as mundane as a power grid has a place in this argument, because when systems become exposed to market mechanisms and when they are being owned by multinationals, they become uncontrollable in a way that we did not see so often before, and especially not in a country that I come from, like Norway, where a lot of things were state-owned and hence controlled. But when you have this over national, multinational companies, and you have technologies that are sort of uncontrollable because of the market, you enter a very dangerous territory. So what Bernard Stiegler says is it's not just about ownership or nationalizing it. Of course, national borders are hard to maintain in a globalized world, but you need to localize the systems somehow, because it's also not just that we've discovered these problems, we've discovered climate change, or we've discovered the damage that we do to ecosystems. It's also that we are losing the knowledge we once had. So local communities and local cultures, they had a knowledge of the local ecosystem, and the effects of your own actions would play out locally. Now we're in a totally different game, and what happens with industrial systems running out of control is, and this is a Marxist point, is proletarization. And you're proletarianized in the sense that you lose your knowledge. So there is a connection between being a cog in the machine, so to speak, and losing knowledge and losing autonomy. So that from this perspective, what happens even to politicians, even to bankers, even to people that are heads of big companies, is that they no longer know how to control the game they're a part of. They're puppets to movements and systems that are either moving too fast or they're incomprehensible. So somehow you need to innovate the political structures and the social structures as the technical systems evolve, and we're way behind, and we have to move faster and faster. And that's one fascinating thing in the Ministry for the Future, which I would want to ask about, is there's a chapter where there's conversation with Janus Athena, I think. There's this discussion about AI and how technology could plausibly or possibly change the political structures, and that we would have new tools to sort of rig the system in a different way that might be actually productive. I wonder, is this something you stand for yourself, or is it just one facet that you explore?
Really, it's just Janus Athena. I myself feel that the old style politics is going to rule, and that AI is like a calculator and um, n- not intrinsically helpful at the political level. I have a character who thought that more than I do myself. I'm reading the chat line, folks, and it's really interesting. I wish I could respond to everything, but I do want to say a couple of things along the way. That carbon taxes, if they were progressive and you took away the subsidies, you could crush the profitability of burning fossil fuels, and that would make a difference, a huge difference. So do not write off carbon taxes, because this is a tool that already exists that could crush profit. And you all already know this. Capital will only be invested at the highest rate of return, and it will not be invested for moral considerations of the good of the biosphere. It is an algorithm, a stupid algorithm, and this is why capitalism is so bad for us all. Capital is invested at the highest rate of return, and these highest rate of returns have been badly miscalculated by cheating future generations. So there is a system available for crippling that, and right now, fossil fuel extraction is being massively subsidized, even since the um, the signing of the Paris Agreement. Something like $2 trillion more has been invested in more fossil fuels. This is crazy and can be ended. If you had progressive taxes where the more carbon you burned, the more you would have to pay, people would burn less. And also, you could make a fee bait and make some of that money go back to citizens and help them out. Fine. But just making sure it isn't profitable will crush it. Lastly, I want to make this point about nationalization. Almost all the fossil fuels on this planet are under the controls of national governments already, including the United States, because most of the drilling's done on federal lands. So we give licenses to people, to private companies, so that you can demonize if you want, and I do all the time. Call it Exxon, because they're kind of the worst. They have to get leases from the United States government to drill most of the stuff they drill. Although around the world but it's all powered, of course, by the United States imperial system that we're still in, the military. All of that can change at the federal level by way of legislation. It's already nationalized. We just give, and I agree with everybody who says this is Democratic politicians in Washington as well as Republicans. They're semi-bought, and they want funding, and so they do what capitalists ask rather than what their constituencies ask. This is a fatal problem that it would be nice to solve. In the meantime, we solve it by being eco-socialists and by trying to up the numbers and work by way of the discursive battle of convincing people for these acts of legislation. A big new party from the left is not going to appear. Our salvation is in making the Democratic Party that already exists into true leftists that they so often have wimped out on. We are, in fact, part of the Democratic Party and need to drag them to the left. At least this is my view of it.
So we've only got about 15 minutes left in this first hour, so I want to get some of these attendee questions in here. We've got a question from Justin Clark about this half Earth concept that you find that is in your most recent book. It's the question here is just I recently read your article about how living in cities can help us combat climate change. Could you elaborate on your half Earth suggestion and what we who live in cities might do on an organized level?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's not my idea. I really am kind of a reporter. I'm not an idea guy. I read and then I put things off into my novels as if they've happened in the future. So this comes out of E.O. Wilson, great book, Half Earth, and one of the major public intellectuals of our time. Um, Crazily attacked by the left in the 70s for sociobiology, which actually only needs a leftist interpretation to become um, a useful social science, and it's gotten that, in fact. So, okay, Wilson says the rest of the biosphere matters crucially to humanity. This is the eco part of eco-socialism. We are part of a larger um, uh, ecological complex of living creatures. I know you all know that. I won't emphasize it. Um, his contention is that humanity is already going into the cities. Young people are making the choice with their feet, with their lives. The economy's in there. It's kind of crushed. The population densities in some of the big cities are phenomenal, and yet people seem to like it. So, okay, this is a voluntary movement. You don't have to force it by some kind of draconian police state action. People are voting with their feet, going into cities. What does that allow us? If we organize that properly, the energy burn could be less, the carbon burn into the atmosphere, and the rest of the landscape left for wild creatures. He said 50% to kind of shock people, I think. I don't think it's biologically necessary. It's a way to, it's an idea, it's a concept. Like a charismatic megafauna, it's a charismatic mega idea. I'm shocked. I mean, the European Union said, well, let's keep 30% of the landscape free. 30% is already amazing, and yet so much of the countryside's being left by young people, and we could deconstruct the infrastructure so that wild animals could make use of that. Agriculture would have to get smarter, the cities would have to get smarter in their organization, but it's already happening. It could be helpful for the other living creatures. Recently, the Biden administration put out something at the level of a tweet. We want to leave 30% of the United States as open land. Please send us your ideas as to how to do that. Well, my mind was blown because this was a radical idea just 10 years ago. And now it's being taken up by really quite moderate governments. I mean, to put it mildly, European Union is some kind of center-right combinatoire. The Biden administration is, we don't know what yet, but you could certainly say centrist. And yet these proposals are suddenly out there that are ultimately, if not eco-socialist, they are at least eco-humanitarian in acknowledging the other living creatures are important, and we don't want to start a mass extinction event, that's a moral as well as a practical physical crime.
And we've got another question here that's along the lines of a big, scary question, but perhaps an older one. Question is, the population of the Earth has recently doubled. So we all know where this is going. And it is the consumptive behavior of humans that affect climate change. How can we reduce human population ethically and correct the behavior of those who remain? And I think I'd just like to add on to that, there's a global question here, right? That different countries, I think I've heard a lot of talk about this that sounds rather authoritarian and scary and eugenicist. So is there a way that we can tackle that issue without crossing into that territory?
Well, yes, there is, of course, and I want Anders to speak too, but I need to speak on this immediately because this one should be already known to all and not a matter of contention. Women's education creates a lower population growth to the point where we can get into negative population growth. In other words, a drop in the human population. It happens fast. And women's education is a moral good. So this is one of those fantastic cases where social justice, having specifically to do with women's rights, worldwide, of course, and it's already in the UN Declaration of UN Rights, it's already a socialist standard operating procedure. And if it isn't, it has to be. That would be bad. But let's say it is, because it should be. Well, you get women's education and immediately you go below the replacement rate. And people are now talking about a human population of 3 billion. They're talking about cutting the population replacement rate down to 1.5 by the year 2030, entirely through women's rights and women's education. So this, let me say this, there's a leftist knee-jerk response. Oh, you don't get to talk about population. That's like some kind of fascistic eugenicist thing. Think again. It's women's rights that drop the human population. Everywhere they've got their full set of rights and are fully educated, population isn't a problem and is even going down. So please rethink nostrums that were created back when I was young. I mean, really, this is a sort of a 1970s position. And it needs to be adjusted to the obvious new demographic realities.
And Anders, I'd love to hear, from your conversations, your take on this. And as always, I'm always looking to you for a more international viewpoint on these things.
Yeah, sure. I completely agree. I know the argument also from the book Drawdown by Paul Hawking, where he lists 100 different climate solutions. And I think educating women ranks among the top 5, something like that. And it's one of those things that is beneficial in several ways. And I think even if we're in a very dire predicament, there are quite a lot of win-win solutions also within agriculture that we could embrace. So this is certainly, yeah, it's a problem that could very much be solved. But when it comes to population worldwide, well, it's seen as sort of a grave misstep to talk about the population being the problem for obvious reasons, overconsumption in the global north and us blaming the global south and so forth. That said, the amount of resources we are using overall as a sum total of humanity is the problem, not the number of people. So so this must be figured out in some way or another. And I think to those who speak from the global south, it's kind of grotesque when academics and intellectuals or policymakers in the global north point their finger. So so that is one problem. And it was also a problem, of course, that in the 70s it was given so much attention because the population was one of these obvious exponentials that you could show. You could show the hockey stick graph and people would get it. Yeah, this is not going to work. There's going to be too many people. It's going to be, it has to end somewhere. So it was kind of one way of demonstrating an argument in a very unfortunate way, because 20 or 30 or 50 years later, people could say, well, people didn't die in millions and zillions, and we actually solved the problem by having a more efficient agriculture. Well, that came at a price, but anyhow, we found a way out of it. And it was seen as very anti-humanist or something. This is an argument that is always repeated by people who are critical of environmental movements, people that are sort of soft denialists and so forth. So yeah, it's certainly one to be aware of.
Sure. And then I've got another question here from Scott Patterson. Any ideas about how to shield working people from the immediate raise in living costs, often attendant to environmental protection? In other words, is it possible to link environmental protection to raising standards of living in the short term? That seems like a tough one.
Well, I wonder if this is the moment for modern monetary theory as being the eco-socialist Keynesianism of our time, and emphasizing full employment, so that, say, environmental protection is defined not as more costs, but as more employment, meaningful work, that it doesn't happen by magic, but by the installation of new infrastructures and by more labor intensive work that isn't being done by the burning of fossil fuels. And so in multiple ways, what what I like about modern monetary theory, it has two pillars it stands on. One of them is the quantitative easing, the creation of new money that doesn't wreck people's trust in money, and therefore can be done on a permanent stimulus basis in a kind of Keynesian way. And secondly, crucially important to them, a job guarantee, that the governments will give a job to everybody who wants a job that doesn't have one, and include in that a living wage, adequacy, so that you could, if you wanted, anybody, get a job with the government that would pay you enough to live on in the cost of living at that time. That kills capitalism. It is amazing how it is a hatchet blow at the kneecaps of capitalism in their wage pressure, which means fear in working people that they'll lose their job. Those 5% of unemployed people are the immiserated, and that scares the whole precariat, which means most of us, into taking crap jobs, what Graeber called bullshit jobs, that actually don't pay enough to get you at human adequacy. So when MMT talks about the job guarantee, they capitalize it, the JG. And it isn't just making up money and giving it to banks like we did in 2008 to do their similarly stupid things to before. It's making up money to pay anyone who wants a job at a living wage in a job guarantee setup that then sets a floor that private enterprise could never go below, or else they would get no workers at all. It's a very powerful leftist technique, and I hope that it gets more widely talked about and put into position.
I've lost track of the question I was looking for, but I do remember the gist. Has been sticking in my mind. It's this question of, capitalism is a system based on growth, which seems to be antithetical to everything we're talking about doing here. How important is it that we shift away from a society obsessed with growth, and how can we break what feels at times like a religion of growth for people,
Anders, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complex, but it's certainly growthism as an ideology and sort of as a yardstick, as a way of measuring success for a nation or for a person or whatever, to demonstrate growth at every given point, needs to be replaced by something else and a more sophisticated idea of growth. And it seems sort of like a cliche to say quality and quantity, but in one sense it's right that we can have a growth in knowledge, for instance, that is not harmful to the use of resources and to the environment. And there is a movement towards an economy that is more based on services, information, all these things that can still grow. But it's an incredibly tricky question to say, like, should we stop growing altogether in the economy or in our sort of also in how much we use of natural resources? Because as we see, even the energy consumption of the internet, which is supposed to be pure information, everybody knows by now that it requires a lot of energy and a lot of hardware, and there's a lot of changing of machinery, of components, upgrading, and so forth. So the dream of like moving the economy entirely into a field that is based on information is, of course, an illusion. But I don't think there's a very simple answer, but it sort of begs the question: if you want to replace capitalism with something else, how different can it be? Are we able to imagine the kind of society, the kind of economy that could run on for not only 50 years, 100 years, but for 1,000 years? Is anyone capable of dreaming up a way of living in this world that is not consuming in an irreversible way? I think that's an enormous challenge, and I think we're nowhere near imagining that kind of a society.
I want to add that I don't like the term degrowth just as terminology. and I know what it's referring to, but I think that it essentially falls into a simple binary rather than a dialectical term. And it seems to acknowledge that we still need to do something that is quantitative. And so growth is such a general term, and I know it is necessary. In fact, capital has to grow or else it isn't doing its job, as people have said in the chat. That's absolutely right. It's definitional. But to get out of that and become ecologically sustainable over the long haul, you need post-capitalism. So there needs to be a different definition of who owns capital and what we do with it. And the growth would have to be in, as Anders suggested, uh, a, knowledge, but I would also say sophistication, stylishness, a growth in the ability to appreciate life without burning more of the Earth's resources than you're putting back in. Because a lot of our supposed wants are um, falsely pumped up in a commodity way by capitalist advertising and the like, we live in a somewhat false reality of what's actually fun or fulfilling. And so growth could be in growth of intelligence or wisdom, of getting to a lower carbon burn and use of the Earth's resources and a higher happiness. So there are some indexes, because growth is kind of an economic index, again, capitalist. So you propose new indexes that rate different things. You ask people what they want out of their lives, and then you make that into an index that can be measured by economists who are no longer capitalist economists. It's important to look at socialist economics and see where it was fatally flawed by trying to compete with world capitalism. It's important to think about post-capitalist economics as it already exists in the world, like in Mondragon or Kerala. And cooperative movement, that is by no means just another way of being capitalist. If the whole world was in co-ops, you would be in a post-capitalist world of a certain kind. So there are ways of combating this religion of growth, as you called it.
Great. Well, we're starting to, I think we're to the end of our hour. It's been great, and I could talk about this stuff forever, but it's time to pass things off to Ashik Sadiq and Jamila Elder. Thank you, Stan and Anders, for joining us. This has been great, and I loved reading both your books. So I'm going to just pass it off now to Ashik Sadiq and Jamila Elder from DSA's Ecosocialism and Green New Deal groups, so they can let you know about what the DSA is up to and how you can get involved. Thanks.
Thank you. Yep.
Jamila, you're on mute.
All right, let me try this again. Hi there. I'm going to share my screen in just a moment so that we can get going and share with you some of the campaigns that we have going with the Ecosocialist work group of DSA. So let me pull that up just a second. Okay, just give me a thumbs up that everyone can see. Great. All right. So as was mentioned, Ashik and I are going to tag team this portion of the presentation, and we're going to talk about the different campaigns that you can be involved with DSA. We'll talk about our Green New Deal campaign and give you some links to get involved. But before we get started, we should talk about what ecosocialism is. And I know it was discussed quite a bit in the first hour of the presentation. But one of the things that for myself, as I was getting involved into ecosocialism, that grounded me in a difference between ecosocialism and climate activism in those differences. And I saw a lot of you talk about that quite a bit in the chat, is the fact that ecosocialism is grounded in understanding that the struggle for climate is also grounded in other struggles. So things like racism, imperialism, indigenous sovereignty, working class power, and feminism. We can't solve all the issues that we're facing with the climate if we don't have solutions for these. And we work towards systems, both economic and political, that provide us with solutions. And if we don't recognize that we have to solve these before we get to solving the climate, we're never going to succeed. So understanding that the reason why natural gas plants are within feet of communities of color, and understand why pipelines get built through indigenous lands, and why the US is in endless wars over resources, all contribute to the situation that we're in right now with the climate. And that's what ecosocialism is. So our solution to ecosocialism is, of course, the Green New Deal, because we need a solution that meets the magnitude of the moment. And you see here flashing on the screen our G&D principles, which I'm not going to go into all that much detail. You can definitely read about them more on our Ecosocialist site. And I think Ashik might drop the link in the chat for all of you. But suffice it to say that our Green New Deal must meet all of these principles for us to be able to solve the solution, which brings us to where we are today. So we have Biden, and we need to continue to organize and mobilize to get some substantive policies done. You know, that he's only a few weeks into his administration, but he started out promising, got us back into the Paris Climate Agreement, canceled the Keystone Pipeline, which are all great things, but these are also things that just bring us back to the status quo, and the status quo is not enough. We need bolder and more aggressive solutions, and there are indications that Biden is interested in stimulus bills that potentially can put trillions into green infrastructure. But we also have to keep in mind and ask ourselves on what terms. You know, is it on you know, the terms of capitalists like Elon Musk and the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, who have been continuously busting labor organizing? Is it to continue to find new ways to exploit workers? We have to continue to push back against that, because rewarding those capitalists and those companies who are responsible for causing the climate crisis is not the answer. We have to look for solutions that are democratic. And you know, for us, again, it's about building power behind our national organizing infrastructure to realize a bold plan like the Green New Deal. We have actually 3 pillars that we are focusing on, one of which is the PRO Act, because without a strong labor movement, we can't succeed. And Ashik is going to take you through that in just a bit. Our 2 other pillars are the Green People's Bailout and Jobs Guarantee, which was discussed quite a lot over the course of the hour. Our first focus, however, is building that strong labor movement, and Ashik is going to take you through that right now.
Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Ashik Sadiq. I'm with the Green New Deal Campaign Committee and on the steering committee of the Ecosocialist Working Group. So Stan and the other discussants laid out a lot of things that would be very helpful in actually winning an ecological future, like a job guarantee. But in order to win really anything that we want, especially with the government that's still has yet to prove its climate bona fides. We need a stronger labor movement. We need a strong, empowered working class that can fight to win a lot of the changes that we need. So as a socialist organization, that's something that we're thinking a lot about in developing a theory of change that's prepared to win the things that we need toward a Green New Deal and beyond. So a big focus right now for DSA is the PRO Act, which is protecting the right to organize. And the reason this is a key priority is because if you look at the history of really any major gains throughout the 20th century, they were won with the backbone of organized labor that was militant and prepared to put a lot on the line to win big demands. And the labor movement is historically weak right now, but unionization rates are actually pretty comparable to what they were at the beginning of the Great Depression, which is when mass worker action increased really dramatically over that decade to win massive advances for the working class. And that led on to major victories through the civil rights movement and beyond until neoliberalism took off in the late 70s and 80s. So rebuilding that capacity for militant labor organizing is pretty crucial to DSA's theory of change for a Green New Deal. And these charts to show you a little bit about strike actions over the course of the 20th century. There was just a huge spike throughout the 30s, and each year of the New Deal, as concessions were won from the Roosevelt administration, workers did not get complacent. They just kept organizing and getting more radical and organizing more people, and capitalists had to compromise for fear of actual revolution. So workers kept raising expectations and getting even more organized for even more expansive demands throughout that decade. And labor has been on the defensive for decades, under attack by corporate power and neoliberal governments that have worked very successfully to undo a lot of the gains of the New Deal and the civil rights movement. But there has been a recent increase, especially through the time of COVID, in strike actions. And the PRO Act is something that would be a massive gain for rebuilding this capacity. It would, next slide. The PRO Act would effectively reverse right-to-work laws that have been put into practice over the past few decades and are now in place in over half of all states of the United States. And these are laws that have just limited the right of workers to organize. And they have fundamentally racist foundations that were meant to divide workers in the Jim Crow South and throughout the country. So reversing this and allowing and expanding the right to organize would just be a huge boost, and then removing a barrier to organizing. Next slide. So this is a coalition that DSA is participating in right now, led by the Painters Union, IUPAT. Over 100 unions have endorsed this campaign. This is actually something that the Biden administration and many Democrats in power have stated their support for. It actually passed in the House, I think last year or the year before. Now Democrats are actually in power, and it's going to be a big fight to see if they actually pass it, now that they have a slim majority in the Senate. So this is going to be a really big fight. As soon as it's presented in the House and Senate, capitalists, like the heads of corporations, are going to come out swinging to try to limit it. So this is something that DSA is really throwing down for. And we're the Green New Deal Campaign Committee is coordinating with the Labor Commission nationally. So this is a really big step forward for internal organizing across DSA. It's a really big organization, and we're trying to pool our resources to make this the strong effort. Next slide. And you might ask, yeah, how do we, like, why is this labor focus a focus of the Green New Deal as opposed to, focusing more immediately on things like public power or a job guarantee, which are more well-known demands that a lot of chapters are organizing for? We are running with the tagline, "Workers and the world unite," which of course is a riff on the famous phrase of the Communist Manifesto, which we altered a bit to communicate that empowering workers and saving the planet should be the same political project. We need to directly refute the idea that there is a trade-off between addressing climate change and material improvements and dignity for working class people, and instead view an empowered working class as the agent of change toward winning transformative policies like a Green New Deal. So in the next few weeks, we'll be putting out a social media campaign and talking points to help people across DSA and beyond get hyped about this campaign and really communicate the importance of winning the PRO Act on its own terms, but also toward real climate action. We think this is a precondition to winning a lot of Green New Deal demands over the next decade. Like, if this can be won in the next year, and it's going to be a big fight, that could really change the political landscape toward winning a lot of the bigger transformative demands that Stan laid out tonight. So this timeline just gives you a sense of what's coming up. We're asking folks to save the date of March 7th for a big mass call where we're going to have a bunch of really exciting speakers that we will be announcing imminently after this call. So look out for that. We'll follow up to folks with folks registered for this call, or you can check our social media accounts to get details for RSVPing to that. And we're hoping that this is going to be the beginning of a wave of action leading into May Day, which is May 1st. Next slide. You can plug in at this form, bit.ly/DSA PRO Act, save the date, and we're asking folks to plug in by just getting involved in their chapters. First of all, we already have a bunch of chapters across DSA committed to participating in this campaign. And we're also working on toolkits to plug folks in who are union members or not to develop stronger relationships with unions in their area who might be willing to participate in this campaign. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, and Jamila will take it back with some other stuff that we have going on.
Thank you, Ashik. I did notice in the chat too, many of you mentioned what was happening in Texas, and obviously it's devastated the state and the people who live there. And if there isn't a stronger case for the need for public power, I don't know what is. But we were able to actually quickly mobilize towards the end of last week, and we did a webinar with many of our comrades in Texas within our DSA chapters who were organizing on the ground to help the communities that were affected, and also explain what was really happening within the state, and all of to address the numerous amounts of misinformation and disinformation that is being put out there. So we are continuing to mobilize for the people in Texas. And if you want to get involved, please go to powerfortexas.org, where you can sign up to help. There's never been a greater need for public power. And we have several of our chapters across the country who have campaigns that they're organizing for. And you see the links posted here if you are interested in joining those movements, because what's going on in Texas is basically a failure of the energy infrastructure within the state because of not only direct climate impact, but also because of the vast amounts of privatization, deregulation, neglect, and lack of investment in the energy infrastructure within the state. And this is something that is going to continue to happen, and we need to address it through public power campaigns. One other way to help in Texas, there's a link here if you would like to contribute to the numerous resources that have been put together and donate to mutual aid efforts. So if you would like to help, that is available also. And then, of course, different ways to plug in to the DSA and the Ecosocialist work group. We have all of our social media handles here, our site once again, and then we have an email address too if you would like to contact us for any specific questions related to anything we've talked about tonight. We do thank you for sticking around to listen to us. And if you have questions, we would like to be able to answer them for you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. So I can take a look.
And we can also bring back anybody from the first hour who is still on and wants to take any more questions. No obligation.
So we have a question here from Maxine. Where is the AFL-CIO in the PROACT fight?
That's a great question. So they are in support. This broadly has the support of major labor unions. I think it's still a question of what resources will be put in by which unions to really throw down. So you can see the main coalition that we're participating in at passtheproact.org, which is led by IUPAT, the Painters Union, and there's a bunch of other major ones plugged in, and DSA is part of this coalition.
Any other questions? And again, either on anything we've presented or any of the earlier discussion.
I see a good question in the Q&A. How do we get public control away from the current owners, the funders of political campaigns? Well, a big part of that is through building up organizations like DSA that are independently funded by members and can pool resources to build an alternative to political campaigns that are heavily funded by corporate interests in the Democratic Party, and make sure that we're building up our own people who can run for office and be answerable to orgs like DSA. So, we're only a few steps forward in that regard, but we're continuing to build power. Another person is asking about ending the 8-hour workday. A 5-hour work week would work, or work day. 5-hour work week sounds great. We agree. Shorter work weeks are definitely an important step toward just reducing unnecessary consumption and just giving people more free time to actually enjoy their lives and have leisure time. So that's a really important reform. In the original New Deal, I think that's how a 40-hour work week was won. The actual demand from unions and socialists at the time, I think, was 30 hours. So yeah, I think that's a good mass demand to be bringing up. And I think in Europe, some countries have already implemented shorter work weeks. So we're all for that. Another person is asking, what is the timeline for the PROACT? We laid out a timeline until May Day. What if it takes longer than that? Do we move on to steps 2 and 3? We'll see. I think we just saw something saying that the House might introduce it as soon as next month. And what happens after that, we'll see. But we'll be prepared to escalate and adjust as needed. It could be a longer fight, but we're just starting to pull our resources for it. Any more questions?
Anyone else?
Will the slideshow be available? We can see about sending it out to folks after this. Someone is asking, would you put the initiatives of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation as example of fake policies? That's a very good question. I would say it's generally very good to have a healthy skepticism of anything that's being promoted by billionaires. and just extremely well-resourced foundations that are often just means for billionaires to shuffle their own money around and dictate what the rest of the world should do. So yeah, I mean, if Anders or somebody wants to take that question, I think it's a really good one. But I think I would say yes.
Yeah, I'm following Bill Gates a little bit or quite a bit, and I know that, for instance, he's heavily into researching geoengineering, which is it's very hard to say if that is conducive to the right kind of changes. And apart from that, he's very much aware of people's skepticism towards him. And so rhetorically, it's very interesting to follow him, how he kind of wiggles out. But certainly, I think it's way better that he cares than that he doesn't care. At least it becomes something that he needs to answer to, and he goes ahead as an example in that sense. And I think, well, even Jeff Bezos has tried to sort of position himself as someone who's doing something for the climate. I think it would be wrong not to welcome it, but I think a big doses of skepticism is needed to take it the right way.
We do have a question in the chat. Will there be talking points and a PROACT available for lobbying with senators as an example? So yeah, actually, if you fill out, I just posted the link in the chat. So actually, if you go to that link and fill that out, you will be on our list for communications. And we are putting together organizing toolkits and a lot of talking points that you will be able to use for all kinds of organizing. And as Ashik mentioned, we do have a tentatively scheduled webinar on March 7th, where we will talk a bit further on what types of things you will be able to do as part of the PROACT.
If there's time, I would love to add to what Anders said about billionaires. And I feel like they should be neither lionized nor demonized. But as socialists, we should insist on the fact that there should be no such thing as billionaires at all, that the system itself is malformed. And there should be a cap on personal wealth as well as a floor that keeps people from falling into misery. But the whole, it's part of the, what you could call the personalization of our commodity culture to make these individuals into heroes or villains, when in fact they're just the people that have stumbled into the first internet store or the first internet pay system, et cetera, et cetera. They're not exceptional in any way, except for this wealth which ought not to exist. And we ought to make that point every time we talk about them. And thank you, by the way. I've been listening in. It's been I really think eco-socialism is the term, if you had to pick one, that covers all the necessary bases of right now. So I'm really happy to see that part of your program.
Thank you.
That's all for me.
Great. Perfect.
All right, I'm not seeing any new questions come in. But you hopefully have our contact information. There's an email address that we posted. And if you think of other questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And we hope you will join us in this movement. And we would love for all of you to be a part of the organizing efforts for the PROACT and beyond.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, that's the end of the live stream. Thank you so much for joining us. You're on mute, Stan, if you were saying anything.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to say bye and thank you to everybody. Thank you, Anders. We'll talk on again on another channel. And I have to split. Oh, thank you, Mike. That was really
Yeah,
appreciate-
thanks, Mike. And
appreciate
thanks
the
a lot to you
moderating.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Wonderful evening.
Yeah,
Have
this
a
was
good
really
evening,
fun.
everybody. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. It was great.